I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Welcome. And to those who are watching online, we're glad you've tuned in today. We are finishing up our series on the Ten Commandments this morning. As we think about those 10 commandments, we get to the very last one. Aesop told a fable years ago about a dog, and the dog was given a bone by a butcher. Maybe you've heard this one. The dog was given a bone by the butcher, and so the dog is walking along, and he's on this footbridge across the creek, the water, and he looks down into the water, and he sees his reflection. And he sees a dog holding a bone, except the bone is twice as big as the one he has in his mouth. So he thinks, I want that bone. So he leaps into the water to get the bigger bone, only to realize that he's in water. And he drops the bone the butcher gave him. He splashes around and finally he gets out of the water without a bone. He had a bone, and now at once he had nothing. I think about that story, and I think about our country and where we live and our culture and our society, and that is the picture of our world in many ways. We have the things that we have been given, and yet there's always something that tells us we need more, or we need something bigger or better or shinier or whatever. There's always another commercial that says you need this, even though you've probably never thought about you needing that before until that commercial said you do. That's our culture. It's built on accumulating stuff. And then we think about the 10th commandment. You shall not covet. You shall not covet. In Exodus 20, he says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservants, or his maidservants, his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. You shall not covet. It's interesting as we think about the 10 commandments how it ends with this one, that you shall not covet. Deuteronomy phrases it just a little bit differently than this, but in Exodus it's almost like he's saying don't covet your neighbor's house, and then he gives some specifics about things that are in the house that would have value. The wife, the servants, the animals. Don't covet anything that the neighbor has. Don't desire it. To covet is to desire something that doesn't belong to me. That belongs to someone else. The other commandments that we've looked at are all based on an action. These last 6 have to do with how we love our neighbor. Honor your father and your mother. Take care of them. Don't kill people. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. But this one is different. It's not based on an action, it's based on a heart. And so the last commandment gets to the heart. He says, don't have a heart that desires things that don't belong to you. Have a heart that desires the right things. Have a heart that desires God, that worships Him and honors Him. Have the right heart. Because if our heart is right, then our actions become right. And at the heart of all of the other commandments, it's driven by the heart. Do not steal. We steal because we want something that belongs to someone else. It's driven by covetousness. Or, don't commit adultery. We talked about that with David. David coveted his neighbor's wife and has adultery with Bathsheba. He covets that person that doesn't belong to him. Covetous doesn't have to just be about a thing. It can be about people. It can be about positions. It can be about anything that we want that we don't have and belongs to someone else. And it leads us to do things that aren't good. All of the commandments have a positive flip side, if you will, with them. You know, if we don't murder, that means we should love our neighbor. Stealing would imply that we should get a job. And covet would imply that we should learn to be content. That we should be content with what we have and what God has blessed us with and how He has taken care of us. To just trust in God. To not covet. To be content. It's the theme of the passage that Bill read for us, this idea of being content. To realize that God has blessed us and the things that we have come from Him and He is taking care of us. But that goes in the face of our American culture and the way that we live and the world we live in, which doesn't want us to be content. In fact, we always want something else. And it has this endless cycle in life where there's always something more that we want, whatever it is. But Jesus taught us that we should focus on God and not things. Jesus has a lot to say, really, about contentment when we think about it. We should focus on God and not things. And so over in Luke the 12th chapter, if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. In Luke the 12th chapter, Jesus talks about this very idea. There's a man that comes to Jesus and says, I have inherited this stuff, and I want you to divide the inheritance between me and my brother. And Jesus says to him in verse 14 of Luke 12, Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you? And then he said to them, to the crowd, to his disciples, Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. If you have a King James Version or a New King James Version, it says, be on your guard against covetousness. We could use those two terms, greed and covetous, interchangeably. Desiring things, accumulating things. And so Jesus makes this point. I want you to be on guard against trusting and grabbing and seeking and desiring the stuff of this world, because there's something more important. And then he tells this story, this parable about this rich man. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns, and I will build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Drink and be merry. But God said, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. And then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. He pictures this rich man who has this abundant crop. It says, what am I going to do with all of the stuff that I have? I will just build bigger barns. Wonder if it ever crossed his mind that he should give it away. Bless someone else. I'll build bigger barns and I'll just store it all up. Greed, seeking after things, gives us this false sense of security. That everything is good and we control everything and everything is great. It gives us this false sense of security, like this fool that Jesus is telling this story about. But what he doesn't realize is, you're going to die tonight. And then what good is all this stuff done? And somebody else is just going to get it all. Doesn't do you any good. And yet that's how we live life. Oftentimes, accumulating and hoarding and storing up, trusting in the stuff that we have rather than the God who gives it. Jesus follows up this parable with this incredible story, this section where he talks about don't worry and be anxious about what you wear and what you eat. Doesn't God take care of the birds and feed them? And doesn't he take care of the lilies and the flowers in the field and take care of all of them? You should just seek first his kingdom. Seek first his kingdom. Don't get anxious and worried about the stuff of this world. Just seek first God. Focus on God, not things. It's the message he tried to get across to the rich young man over in Mark the 12th chapter. In Mark the 12th chapter, as the rich young man comes to Jesus, says, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, keep the commandments. He said, which ones? And he says, and he picks out all the ones about loving your neighbor. Don't murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and your mother. It's interesting as you look at that list, defraud is the parallel to covet. In fact, to defraud is to practice coveting something that doesn't belong to you. In fact, probably a lot of rich people became that way by defrauding or taking advantage of others. It says, don't defraud. And then Jesus tells the man, after he says, I've done all of these things, he says, one more thing you need to do. Just sell it all and come and follow me. Just come and follow me. Jesus is basically saying to him, your life isn't wrapped up in the stuff that you have and all the wealth that you have. You need to just follow me. I am sufficient. Following God is sufficient. God can take care of you. Just trust me that I will take care of you, that I will bring you joy, that I will bring you happiness, that I will bring you security. Just trust me. Not all the wealth that you have. But that's the delusion of our world and our culture and our lives, is that all the stuff we have brings us happiness and joy and security and everything. And when we get to that point, we realize that, oh, I don't need God. But what we really need to realize is that it is God who gives us a sufficient life, that he takes care of everything, that he gives us happiness, that he gives us security. Not the stuff that we have. And so Jesus says, focus on God, not on things. We have to learn to be content. That's a challenge in a world that teaches us that life is about stuff and things and our position and everything else that we have. And so how do we learn to be content? How do we learn to be content? Paul talks about that in Philippians 4. I have learned in all circumstances to be content. So what do? Here are 3 ideas for you. Contentment begins in a person, Jesus, and not in things. Contentment begins in trusting in Jesus, in a person, not in stuff that we have. It's what Jesus is trying to get the rich young man to realize. You need to just trust in me. You need to trust that I will take care of you, that I will be sufficient. That's what he's trying to get across to the person who has inherited everything and trying to divide up the inheritance. He says, here's this story. You need to realize that your sufficiency, what will bring you happiness and joy, everything that you need is in God, not in the stuff. And so as I think about how I can trust in a person and not things, I need to go about my life on a daily basis, nurturing my relationship with God. I need to spend time in the Word. I need to hear what God has to say. I need to hear Him tell me that He is sufficient, that He will take care of me, that He who took care of the birds and the flowers, that I'm more important than them and He will take care of me. I need to be feeding my soul those messages from the Word, and I need to read what God says to me in His Word, and I need to talk to Him and pray. And I need to gather with Christians and enjoy the fellowship of each other and realize that God has given us a family that will help us no matter what life brings. I need to nurture that relationship I have with God so that I trust in a person and not stuff. Second, I need to realize that contentment begins with a godly attitude and not in the circumstances of my life. I think about the Apostle Paul and what he says in Philippians 4. I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it's like to have plenty, and I know what it's like to be in want. I've been on both ends of the spectrum, Paul says, and I have learned to be content because I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me. That contentment and happiness and joy in life is not based on the circumstances of life. It's based on my attitude. An attitude that stems from my relationship with God and realizing that He takes care of me. It's having a better attitude about life. We get overwhelmed by the circumstances of life and what's happening. We get frustrated. We become anxious and we worry about the things that happen in life. But Paul, in the section just before he talks about being content, he says, don't be anxious and worry about things. Just pray. Take your petitions to God and be thankful. If you want to have a different attitude, a godly attitude about the circumstances of life when life is throwing you a curve and life doesn't seem to be going the way you want it to be, and when everything seems maybe to be falling apart around you, listen to what Paul says. Be thankful. Stop. Count your blessings. Make a list. Pray to God. Thank Him for what He has given you. We can learn to be content when we nurture our relationship with God, and then when we realize that God is blessing me and I begin to thank Him for the things that I have, not the things that I don't have, or the things that I wish I had, or how I wish things could be different than they are. I thank Him for what I have, what God is doing for me, and how He is helping me. Be thankful and have a godly attitude. And finally, I think we can learn to be content in giving and not hoarding. Isn't that the message that we're seeing from Jesus when we think about the rich fool? He's hoarding everything up, but he's not finding happiness. Isn't that the message he's trying to give to the rich young man? He says, you just need to give things away and come and follow me. Just trust me. I read once in a book, it said you do not get attached to the things you give away. Pretty obvious. We don't think about that often. The stuff that we're attached to is the stuff we hang on to. But we don't get attached to anything we give away because we don't own it anymore. But maybe we should practice that more often. Give. Don't hoard. God has blessed us. It's probably not wise to give everything you have away, because then you wouldn't have anything to eat and take care of your family, and God wants us to do that too. But God has blessed us abundantly with opportunities sometimes to help others. We can give in many different ways. We can give to our church. We can give to a charity. We can give to somebody that we know that is in need. And sometimes we should give without anybody knowing it. And maybe without taking a tax deduction too. Just to give. Just give. Help others. Bless others with what you have given, and it begins to change our attitude about our stuff. We begin to realize that what we have is a blessing from God to be used, not just for us, but for the benefit of others. And I can learn to not be so attached to the stuff of this world, but to the opportunity to bless others and to minister to them. We can learn to be content by trusting in a person, Jesus, and not things. By having the right attitude about life when the circumstances aren't good. And by learning to give and bless others rather than hoarding things up that we probably don't even need. The 10 Commandments are an ethic about how to live. It starts with God. You shall have no other gods. Don't create any graven images or idols. Don't misuse his name. Honor him and revere him. Keep the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor God. And then honor your parents. And do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie or bear false testimony. And do not covet. And he ends the last one with the heart. Because if our heart is right, everything else begins to flow the way it's supposed to. Have the right heart. And learn to be content. Dear Abby published a poem back in 1989, I believe it was. February 14th, 1989, published this poem. It was in the Chicago Tribune. Somebody had sent her this poem. A grandmother sent a poem that her grandson had written. He lived in New Haven, Connecticut. 14 years old. 14 years old, he wrote this poem. The grandmother said, "This is good. I should share it." Dear Abby agreed. In fact, she was so overwhelmed by the poem that she called him. The story goes, she called him to make sure he really wrote it, because it seemed far, far more mature than what you would think of a 14-year-old saying. And this is his poem, called Present Tense. It was spring, but it was summer I wanted. The warm days and the great outdoors. It was summer, but it was fall I wanted. The colorful leaves and the cool, dry air. It was fall, but it was winter I wanted. The beautiful snow and the joy of the holiday season. It was winter, but it was spring I wanted. The warmth and the blossoming of nature. I was a child, but it was adulthood I wanted, the freedom and the respect. I was 20, but it was 30 I wanted, to be mature and sophisticated. I was middle-aged, but it was 20 I wanted, the youth and the free spirit. I was retired, but it was middle age I wanted, the presence of mind without limitations. My life was over, but I never got what I wanted. We go through life always wanting more, something else. And he's right. We got to go through life just to be content where we're at, to enjoy life where we're at, and to serve God where we're at, to be content, to let God use us at this stage of our life, wherever we're at, with whatever we have, to be content, and let God work through us. Do that this week as you go. Focus on your relationship with God. Be thankful every day for the things He has given you, and look for ways to serve others. Let's stand and sing.
Prince of Peace, control my will, bid this struggling heart be still. In my fears unbowing cease, crush my spirit into peace. Continue on singing.